At exactly 5:17 on a Sunday morning, Elias Mercer found a black suitcase standing in the middle of Blackwater Bridge. There was one problem. The bridge was covered in fresh rain. But around the suitcase the ground was perfectly dry. No footprints, no wagon tracks, nothing. Elias was the only person on the bridge. He stood there with his lantern raised, staring at the suitcase while the river moved somewhere beneath his feet. Then something inside the suitcase knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Elias stepped back. He had heard stories about Blackwater Bridge all his life. In 1887, a carriage carrying 5 people had disappeared from this exact stretch of road. The town claimed there had been 4 passengers. Elias's father had always insisted there were 5. Elias slowly reached for the brass clasp. Before we find out what was inside that suitcase, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who enjoys a good mystery. It helps us keep bringing these old, forgotten stories to life. Now, Elias opened the suitcase. Inside was a child's shoe. Only one. The leather was cracked, the sole caked with dried mud, and a thin red thread was tied around the lace. Elias picked it up. Something rattled inside. He turned the shoe upside down. A small brass button fell into his palm. He knew that button. He had seen one exactly like it in an old photograph of the men who disappeared on Blackwater Bridge in 1887. Elias looked back toward the road, still empty. Then he noticed a number scratched into the shoe's sole. He didn't understand it. Not yet. But 3 days later, a 17-year-old boy would disappear beside the river. And when Elias returned to Blackwater Bridge the following Sunday, another suitcase would be waiting for him. This time it would contain a watch that had stopped at exactly 7:18, but before that Sunday came, Elias had to explain the child's shoe. The missing boy was 17-year-old Samuel Pike, a mill worker's son who had vanished near the river on Wednesday afternoon. Search parties had found his cap on the bank, but nothing else. When Elias heard the news, he went straight to the sheriff. "You remember the shoe?" Sheriff Bell was standing behind his desk, reading a telegram. "I remember. It was a boy's shoe." Bell looked up. "So?" "The boy who disappeared was 17. Bell slowly folded the telegram. "Elias, don't start connecting things that don't belong together. I found a railway button inside it." Bell's expression changed. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bell opened a drawer and took out a small envelope. "I found this in my father's things years ago." Inside was a faded photograph of Blackwater Bridge. 4 men stood beside a carriage. Elias stared at it. "Where's the 5th?" Bell tapped the photograph. "That's the trouble." The following Sunday, Elias reached the bridge before sunrise. He expected to find nothing. Instead, the black suitcase was waiting exactly where he had found the first one. Same leather, same brass clasps, same impossible absence of footprints. Elias didn't touch it for several seconds. Then he opened it. Inside was a pocket watch. The glass was cracked. The hands had stopped at 7:18. On the back, someone had scratched 2 letters. MP Elias knew those initials. Matthew Pike, Samuel Pike's father. The man had worked at the railway depot for 30 years. Elias closed his eyes briefly. This was no longer a prank. He carried the suitcase to the sheriff's office. Matthew Pike was already there. He looked at the watch and went completely still. "Where did you get that?" "It was in the suitcase." Matthew's face had gone pale. "I buried that watch." "When?" 25 years ago." Elias stared at him. Matthew looked toward the window. "October 1887. Sheriff Bell stepped closer. "What happened to it?" Matthew swallowed. "My father found it on the bridge the morning after the carriage disappeared." Elias looked down at the stopped hands. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Matthew gave a bitter little laugh. "Because my father told me something." "What?" Matthew looked directly at Elias. "He said the watch wasn't broken." Elias frowned. Then why did it stop? Matthew's voice dropped. Because at 7:18, someone was still alive. A cold silence filled the room. Outside, church bells began ringing for Sunday service. 7 times. Elias looked at the watch again. The hands had moved. Just 1 minute, 10:19. And somewhere far beyond the walls of the sheriff's office, a train whistle sounded from the abandoned railway line. Elias turned toward the window. The sound came again. 1 long blast, then 2 short ones. Sheriff Bell had gone pale. That railway hasn't carried a train in 19 years, he said. Matthew Pike stared at the pocket watch in Elias's hand. Not that railway. Elias looked at him. What does that mean? Matthew didn't answer. He walked to the door. Come with me. They crossed the muddy street toward the old telegraph office, a narrow wooden building that had been locked since the railway line was abandoned. Matthew produced a key from his coat. Elias watched him unlock the door. You've been here before. Once. When? October 1887. Inside, the room smelled of dust, damp wood, and old paper. A dead telegraph machine sat beneath the window. Matthew crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a leather folder. These belonged to my father. He placed several papers on the desk. Elias read the first report. October 18th, 1887. Blackwater Bridge. Carriage missing. 4 passengers presumed lost. He turned the page. There should have been another sheet. There wasn't. What happened to the rest? Matthew looked at the floor. My father tore it out. Why? He said the last page wasn't meant for the sheriff. Elias looked up. Who was it meant for? Matthew's answer came quietly. The 5th passenger. Before Elias could respond, something struck the window. Both men turned. Nothing. Then another sound came from outside. Footsteps. Slow. Wet. Elias opened the door. The street was empty, but muddy footprints crossed the road toward the bridge. They stopped directly beneath the old railway sign. Elias followed them. On the ground lay a small black envelope. Inside was a glass photographic plate. Matthew's hands began trembling when he saw it. Where did you get this? Elias held it toward the light. The image showed Blackwater Bridge. But something was wrong. The photograph was dated 1887. The bridge looked exactly as it did now. Same iron beams, same railing, same broken stone marker near the eastern entrance. Elias brought the plate closer. There were 5 people standing beside the bridge. 4 were clearly visible. The 5th stood with his back turned. Elias stared at the man's coat. Dark wool, long collar, brass button at the shoulder. His own coat was hanging from his shoulders. The same cut. The same brass button. Matthew whispered, "That's impossible." Elias turned the plate over. Someone had written a sentence across the glass in faded ink. He read it aloud. The 5th man must not be allowed to cross. A sound came from the bridge. 3 slow knocks. Elias looked up. At the exact center of the bridge, something black stood against the gray morning. Another suitcase. They had already searched the bridge. There had been nothing there. Elias started walking toward it. Matthew grabbed his arm. "Don't." Elias stopped. "Why?" Matthew's eyes remained fixed on the suitcase. "Because my father said the first 2 suitcases were never supposed to be opened." Elias looked at him. "First 2?" Matthew said nothing, and Elias suddenly understood. The suitcase on the bridge wasn't the second one. It was the 3rd. Elias kept his eyes on the black case. "What happened to the first 2? Matthew released his arm. "My father opened one." "And the other?" "He never found it." Elias stepped onto the bridge. The iron beneath his boots gave a low groan as the river pushed against the stone supports below. Matthew followed reluctantly, keeping several paces behind. The suitcase waited at the center. Elias crouched beside it. The brass clasp was already open. Inside lay a wedding ring wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth. There was something else beneath it. A railway ticket. Elias picked it up. His fingers tightened. The date printed across the top was October 20th, 1912. 3 days from now. The destination was Blackwater. The passenger's name had been burned away. Only the first letter remained. E. Matthew stared at the ticket. Who travels to Blackwater on a line that doesn't exist anymore? Elias looked toward the abandoned railway. That's what I intend to find out. They returned to the town and went directly to the railway station. The building had been closed for years. Dust covered the ticket counter, and weeds had pushed through cracks in the wooden platform. Elias searched the old timetable cabinet. There was no train scheduled for October 20th, not one. But behind a loose wooden panel, he found a handwritten ledger. He opened it. One entry had been added recently. October 20th, 1912. Blackwater arrival. Passenger. Edwin Mercer. Elias stopped breathing. Matthew looked over his shoulder. Mercer? Elias nodded. My family name. There was no Edwin Mercer in Elias's family. Not that he knew of. Then Matthew pointed to the bottom of the page. A second line had been written beneath the passenger's name. 1 seat reserved. Elias touched the ink. It was still wet. He looked toward the station window. Outside, beyond the empty platform, the abandoned railway disappeared into the trees. A distant whistle sounded. Not from the town. From the tracks. Elias and Matthew stepped outside. The rails were rusted solid. No train could possibly be coming, yet the sound grew louder. Then a headlamp appeared between the trees. Matthew backed away. Elias! The light moved slowly toward them. Elias couldn't move. The train emerged from the darkness without a sound. No smoke, no steam, no engine number. Just a long line of black passenger cars sliding silently along rails that had not carried a train in 19 years. As the first carriage passed, Elias saw a single passenger sitting behind the glass. An old man, wearing a dark wool coat. The man turned his head and looked directly at Elias. Then he raised one hand. In it was a black leather suitcase. The train vanished into the trees. Elias stood frozen. Matthew whispered, "That was him." "Who?" "The fifth passenger." Elias looked down at the railway ticket still in his hand. The burned name had changed. The missing letters were appearing one by one, EDWIN, and beneath the name, a final line slowly surfaced in the paper. Arrival, Sunday. Elias folded the ticket. "Then we have 3 days." Matthew shook his head. "No." Elias looked at him. Matthew's voice trembled. "We have 3 days until he comes back."
Disclaimer. This story is a work of historical supernatural fiction. The characters, events, Blackwater Town, Blackwater Bridge, the Mercer family, and the mysterious suitcase described in this story are fictional and created for entertainment purposes. They should not be understood as accounts of actual people, supernatural events, or a documented disappearance. However, the story is inspired by the real history and atmosphere of West Virginia's Appalachian region. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, railroads expanded through the rugged Blackwater Canyon region, connecting isolated mountain communities and supporting the coal, timber, and railway industries. Historic records document the difficult terrain, railway construction, bridges, and industrial communities that shaped this part of West Virginia. Content reference OASITE GIDS Index. West Virginia has also experienced real and well-documented bridge tragedies. One of the most significant was the December 15, 1967 collapse of the Silver Bridge between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. The disaster killed 46 people and led to major changes in bridge inspection and safety standards across the United States. The National Transportation Safety Board later determined that the collapse began with a fracture in one of the bridge's suspension eye-bars. Content. Reference. OI site. 3. Index. The real historical details in this disclaimer are provided only to establish the historical atmosphere and context of the story. The supernatural mystery, time-related events, missing passengers, suitcases, and characters themselves are entirely fictional. This story is not intended to portray any real historical tragedy as supernatural or to suggest that the documented events actually occurred in the manner described.
Elias kept staring at the railway line long after the last carriage had disappeared. The forest had gone silent again. No whistle, no wheels, not even the wind. Matthew pulled his coat tighter around himself. We should tell Sheriff Bell. Elias looked at the ticket. Tell him what? That a dead man arrived on a train that hasn't existed since 1893? Matthew said nothing. They walked back toward town. Halfway across the station yard, Elias stopped. Something was wrong. His right trouser pocket felt heavier. He reached inside. His fingers closed around cold brass. Elias pulled out a key. He knew it immediately. His house key. He had left it on the kitchen table that morning. Matthew stared at it. Where did you get that? I didn't. Elias checked his other pocket. His real key was still there. 2 identical keys. One warm from his body, the other cold enough to hurt his fingers. There was mud packed into the teeth of the second key. Fresh mud. Matthew took a step backward. Throw it away. Elias looked at him. Why? Because my father found one just like it. Where? Matthew pointed toward the bridge. In the 5th man's pocket. Elias closed his fist around the key. They hurried through town without speaking. By the time Elias reached his house, evening had settled over Blackwater. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. Elias unlocked his front door with his own key. Inside, everything looked untouched. The lamp, the chair, the coat hanging beside the stove. Then he saw the kitchen table. His spare key was no longer there. In its place lay a black leather suitcase. Elias froze. Matthew whispered behind him. Don't open it. Elias stepped closer. The suitcase was wet. Water dripped slowly onto the wooden floor. Yet there was no water on the ceiling. No broken indow. No open door. Elias reached for the clasp. 3 knocks came from inside. He pulled his hand away. 3 more. Matthew backed toward the door. Elias, we leave now. But Elias was staring at the floor. A trail of muddy footprints began beneath the suitcase. They crossed the kitchen, passed through the hallway, and stopped at the front door. The door was locked from the inside. Elias looked at Matthew, then back at the suitcase. He opened it. Inside was not another object. It was a folded sheet of paper. Elias unfolded it. There was only one sentence. The door beneath the bridge is open. Below it was a date. October 20th, 1912. Elias looked toward the window. In the darkness beyond the glass, someone was standing across the street. A man in a long black coat. The same coat from the photograph. The man lifted one hand and pointed toward Blackwater Bridge. Then the lamp beside Elias went out. And the lamp beside Elias went out. For several seconds, nobody moved. The house became completely dark. Then came a sound from outside. A horse. Slow hoofbeats on the road. Elias grabbed his lantern and struck a match. The flame caught. The street outside was empty. The man was gone. Only a line of wet footprints remained beneath the window. Matthew whispered, "We shouldn't go." Elias folded the paper and put it inside his coat. If that door has been open since 1887, I'm going to find out why. They left the house and walked toward the bridge. Rain had begun again. By the time they reached the eastern end, the river below was almost invisible through the mist. Elias climbed beneath the bridge using an old maintenance ladder. Halfway down, his lantern revealed something carved into the iron support. 5 names. 4 had been scratched out. The 5th was untouched. Edwin Mercer. Elias stared at it. Matthew stopped behind him. That's your family. I know. They continued downward. At the base of the bridge, they found an iron door buried beneath ivy and stone. Elias inserted the muddy key. It turned easily. The door opened. A smell of wet earth and old wood came from the darkness. Inside was a narrow passage running beneath the bridge. Their footsteps echoed. After several yards, the tunnel widened. Elias raised the lantern. Something enormous sat in the darkness ahead. A carriage. An old wooden carriage covered in mud. One wheel was broken. The horses were gone. The same carriage that had disappeared in 1887. Matthew's breathing became uneven. No. Elias approached. The carriage door hung open. Inside were 4 old coats, a rusted lantern, and a child's wooden toy. Then Elias noticed the seat. There was room for 5 people. 4 sets of belongings remained. The 5th seat was empty. Until something moved in the darkness behind them. Elias turned. A man stood at the entrance of the tunnel. He wore a black wool coat. His face was pale. His hair was exactly as it appeared in the 1887 photograph. Matthew dropped his lantern. The flame went out. The man looked directly at Elias. You took your time. Elias raised his revolver. Who are you? The man's eyes moved toward the carriage. You know who I am. Edwin Mercer? The man smiled faintly. That was my name. Elias's hand tightened around the gun. You disappeared 25 years ago. Edwin looked almost amused. No. He stepped closer. I was waiting. For what? Edwin reached into his coat. Elias raised the revolver higher. Edwin slowly removed a black leather suitcase. The same suitcase. He placed it on the carriage seat. Then he looked at Elias. The first suitcase was sent in 1887. Elias stared at him. You said the suitcases were predicting the future. I never said that. Then what are they? Edwin opened the suitcase. Inside were dozens of objects. Some belonged to the dead. Some belonged to people Elias knew. And at the bottom lay a fresh bridge inspection report. Elias picked it up. His name was written across the top. The date read, October 20th, 1912. Edwin's voice became almost a whisper. The suitcases don't tell you what will happen. He looked toward the darkness beneath the bridge. They tell you what already happened. Elias looked at the report again. His signature was already on the bottom. He had never signed it. And beneath the signature was a sentence written in his own handwriting. 5 entered the carriage. Only 1 was supposed to return. Elias stared at the sentence until the words seemed to blur. I didn't write this. Edwin didn't move. Not yet. The lantern flame trembled between them. Elias looked at the carriage. Who were the 5? Edwin's eyes moved toward the empty 5th seat. 4 were passengers. And the 5th? Edwin looked directly at him. The 5th was the man who opened the door. Elias felt a coldness move through his chest. What door? Edwin pointed beneath the carriage. There, hidden beneath the mud and wooden frame, was a narrow iron hatch. Elias knelt and pulled it open. Below was black water. Not the river. Something deeper. Something moving slowly beneath the bridge. Then Elias saw objects floating in it. A child's shoe. A pocket watch. A wedding ring. The glass photograph. Every object from the Sunday suitcases. They had not been brought from the future. They had been here all along. Elias stood. So the suitcases. Edwin nodded. Every Sunday, one object is returned. Returned from where? Edwin's face tightened. From the night that never ended. A distant church bell began ringing above them. Once, twice, 3 times. Elias counted. 7. Then the bell stopped. Edwin looked toward the tunnel entrance. Tomorrow is October 20th. Elias understood. The train. Edwin nodded. The train will come again. And the passenger? Edwin looked at him. That depends on you. Elias stepped closer. You've been sending the suitcases. No. Then who has? Edwin's expression changed. For the first time, Elias saw fear in his eyes. You. Elias shook his head. I've never seen this place. You will. Edwin opened the suitcase one final time. At the bottom lay a brass nameplate. Elias Mercer, bridge inspector. Elias stared at it. The metal was blackened and wet, but the date scratched into the back was impossible. 887. Edwin placed it in Elias's hand. Tomorrow, when the train arrives, you will walk onto the bridge. What happens then? You will see the carriage. And then? Edwin's voice became almost inaudible. You will decide which year gets to keep you. The tunnel suddenly shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The old carriage creaked. Then, from somewhere above them, came the sound of horses running across the bridge. Elias looked up. The sound grew louder. Hooves, wheels. A carriage crossing the iron bridge. But the bridge above them was empty. Edwin grabbed Elias's arm. Don't look up. Elias looked anyway. Through the gaps in the old ironwork, he saw 5 figures standing on the bridge. 4 were motionless. The 5th slowly turned. It was Elias, wearing the same coat, holding the same lantern, and staring down at himself. The figure raised one hand. In its palm was a black leather suitcase. Then it opened the suitcase. Inside was the child's shoe. Elias heard Edwin whisper behind him. Now you understand. The 5 figures vanished. The tunnel became silent. Elias looked down at the brass nameplate in his hand. For the first time, the truth was clear. The suitcase had never been waiting for someone to come back. It had been waiting for Elias to remember that he had already been there. Above them, the church bell began ringing. Sunday had arrived, and somewhere on Blackwater Bridge, a black suitcase had just appeared.